Hello and welcome to a session on how to make flexible working actually work for your organisation. So this is what we're going to cover. We're going to look at some of the definitions of flexible working and look at perhaps some of the less traditional ones. We're going to look at what the business case is for flexible working. And then we're going to get into the really important stuff about how do you actually make it happen in your organization. And we're going to look at lots of different examples of companies that are doing it really successfully. So what do we mean by flexible working? Well, we think there are 6 key areas where employers can provide greater flexibility for their people. The one that we all know about is obviously time flexibility. Particularly interesting example is PwC and what they're doing. They've introduced a new program which actually lets its new staff members set their own working hours. So much more proactive than people filling in a flexible working request, you know. So they basically are trying to get talented people, attract them to the organization, but particularly those who are looking and are interested in an alternative to working regular 9 to 5 hours. New recruits can list their preferred working hours, and that can be anything from only working mornings or even taking a couple of months out during the year. Then there's physical flexibility. Again, one that we kind of know fairly well. We know it as things like remote working. But you've got organizations like Basecamp, which is a web application company. They're based in Chicago, and they allow their employees to work from anywhere in the world. They have a kind of mantra, you know, move cities, keep your job. So, you know, a real emphasis on you do not have to be based in that city. You do not have to be coming into work all the time. So much broader definition than the kind of working from home. Perhaps less well known is the idea of career flexibility. You'll obviously have heard of things like sabbaticals, and these are becoming, I think, much more popular and less about having, you know, you've worked for a company for 20 years and then you get to take a sabbatical. If you look at an organization like Vistaprint, they're the promotional product company. They offer a 4-week sabbatical for every 5 years of service. It's called a Vista break, and you can merge this with up to 2 weeks of your vacation time. So you get a 6-week paid leave every 5 years. So really kind of thinking, again, a bit more kind of open about the idea of a sabbatical. You don't have to work there a lifetime before you get it. Another example of career flexibility, though, which we see less of, but I think will become more and more popular, is this idea of being able to move up the grading structure, but also down the grading structure or sideways without it being seen as a negative. Now, there's not too many examples of this yet, but one I want to call out is an NHS trust in the UK, Calderdale and Huddersfield NHS Trust. And here people are allowed to move up and down the grading structure without it being seen as a demotion. It's actually seen as just something that is part of what they offer. They have even something called a retire and return program, so that people who are retiring are offered to come back, but in much more flexible roles. So they're able to retain that great organizational knowledge without necessarily people having to stay in very senior roles. Now, if you're familiar with the work of Linda Grattan, you'll know that her work around the 100-year life and this idea that we just have to continue getting higher and higher promotions as we go through our working life. If we're going to be working for 70, maybe even 80 years, then that's just not going to be feasible. So what she's suggesting is this idea of a lattice career where we're able to take sabbaticals, where we're able to take our foot off the career gas for periods of our life. To move backwards in our career as well as forwards is going to be much more relevant. Another example of flexibility is role flex. So we're obviously seeing more things like job shares and even increasingly job shares being offered in senior roles. I was really delighted, you know, my previous role, my last corporate role as HR director of the BBC is now being done as a job share, which I think is just fantastic. We're still seeing relatively low numbers of job share in the more senior roles, but I think it's definitely something we'll see more of as time goes on. There's also flexibility to do other stuff. And in talking to Nestle and Warner Brothers, two companies that have both, if in different ways, realized that particularly digital talent really want the ability to do stuff outside of work. And so they want to have a career with you, but equally they want to, in Warner Brothers' case, set up their own label. In Nestle's case, digital talent, they realized that they wanted to do their own startup. It wasn't that they weren't committed to you, which has perhaps been the traditional view, but actually they just wanted that greater flexibility to do other stuff outside of the day job. And then finally, annual leave flexibility. Now, obviously, Netflix became very popular. The idea of this unlimited annual leave, take as much leave as you want. LinkedIn also did something similar. And also quite a lot of tech companies like HubSpot have this offer of unlimited leave. Although interestingly, some companies are beginning to withdraw it, not because people were abusing it, but because people weren't taking enough holiday. So that culture of presenteeism was too dominant, and actually people weren't taking enough leave. So 6 different definitions of what flexible working actually looks like. Now let's have a look at the case for flexible working. Now, I think we kind of need a caveat here, which is that the business case alone for some managers is not going to swing it. They can kind of look at these stats that I'm going to present to you now and say, yep, I get that intellectually, but emotionally, I still don't trust it, or I still don't trust my people. But we'll look at that later on. But if you are wanting a kind of hard and fast case for flexible working with your leaders, then here's some stats that might be useful for you. First up, 87% of people want to work flexibly. So it's a real positive when you're trying to attract talent. That's a stat from EY and a company called TimeWise. 22% of millennials said that the lack of flexibility would make them want to leave a job. That's from Deloitte. Company called Zenefits, which does a survey on small businesses, they found that 73% of employees said flexible work arrangements increase their satisfaction at work. A very interesting study by Stanford University found that those allowed to work flexibly from home increased their productivity by 13%. The flexible workers also reported higher levels of work satisfaction and took less sick leave than their office-bound counterparts. So, a kind of productivity measure there as well as an engagement measure. Interesting, 24% of workers in traditional work environments report to love their jobs. This is a study by Leadership IQ, whereas those who were working from home, 87% of those found that they loved their work. So 24% traditional, 87% remote, home-based working, so much higher levels of engagement. And finally, this is the second highest thing that people say that they want from a job, just behind competitive pay and benefits. And this is from an EY survey. So right up there. So I think there's such a strong case in terms of engagement, being able to attract, but also productivity once you've got them working for you. There's a very, very strong case out there. So finally, let's now look at how you can actually make flexible working work. And we're going to look at 4 things: reframing the issue, being flexible with your flexible working, leaders role modeling flexible working in the role that they play, and then having the right tools to make it happen. So first up, reframing the issue. Now, This is a kind of a technique that's being used with things like nudge theory or behavioral economics, which is that if you're going to get people to behave differently, then you have to get them to think about it in a different way. And I wanted to call out two organizations that have done this with flexible working. First up, Unilever. So, as we know, the traditional approach with flexible working is that you put in a request to your manager, the manager considers it and either says no, turns it down, or bestows it upon you as a kind of gift. It's seen as almost like a favor that they're doing you. Well, Unilever were really struggling to get flexible working going, and they said, look, actually, let's come at this from a different angle. So their chief exec said, we're going to have an approach which is that every job can be done flexibly. I'm not going to tell you line managers how to do it. You're grown-ups. You can work it out with the person that works for you. But every job needs to or could have some inherent flexibility. Now, in reality, can every job be done flexibly? Possibly not. But what it did was to help change the mindset just by reframing it in a different way. Now, PwC did something I think very interesting in the way that they challenged managers, because quite a lot of the time managers were saying, yep, I will offer flexibility, but I want them to have earned my trust. So I'm going to work with them for a period of time, and only when they've earned my trust will I allow them to have that flexible approach to their work. What PwC HR team did was to say, you've just hired this person, therefore you trust them enough to work for us. Why on earth wouldn't you trust them enough to allow them to work from home or to work on a part-time basis or whatever it might be? So they really challenged it on the basis that this trust to work flexibly doesn't have to be earned. They've earned that just by being given the job. So a couple of techniques perhaps to try with your leaders, line managers, if they're struggling, just helping to reframe it in a different way. Next up is about how to be much more flexible and fluid with your approach to flexible working. In HR, we often go for a kind of formal policy, and there's some real downsides to this. First up, we can be very prescriptive about what flexible working is. And actually, we're trying to be more employee-centric with flexible working. We're trying to approach it from the basis of what is it that you need to work flexibly, rather than being too prescriptive in a formal document that's got all the very, clear definitions of what is allowed. The other downside is that there is still the case that employees can often feel they are treated differently, as if they're slightly less committed if they are asked to work flexibly. The recent survey suggested that 30% of employees felt they were less valued if they asked to work part-time. So here's a couple of examples of some companies that wanted to be much more fluid, much more employee-centric, much more informal, because they believed that was the best way of getting flexible working going, and this has proved to be the case. So we've got enterprise. They don't call it flexible working, they call it alternative working arrangements, and they wanted it to be as informal as possible. They don't have this kind of formal process where you have to submit a request. It's much more around discussing and agreeing with your line manager about what's right for you. And they found that this has enabled people to be much more empowered to take advantage of it. And then Sodexo, and they adopted a flexible approach to working flexibly to support the varying needs of its global workforce. They first introduced an initiative called Flexibility Works back in 2008. And this was the very traditional approach, where we submit a formal proposal to ask for the option to work flexibly. But they found that it just was at odds with their goal of flexibility, this very formal, rigid process. So they introduced a new initiative called Flow. Flexibility optimizes work. And this practice is about employees working with their managers on an individual basis to craft flexible work options that meet their unique needs. So it could be that someone wants to take the afternoon off occasionally to coach their kids' football team, or it could be that they just wanted some occasional time off. Or they want to work from home, or, so it's much more fluid, much more relaxed, much more informal. The flow approach, this Flexibility Optimizes Work initiative, has also meant that they can accommodate regional preferences with more ease. So they found that as a global company, not all their employees think about flexibility in the same way. In Belgium, for example, managers encourage their employees to come in late, leave early, and then work from home because of the commute. In India, options like half-time work and the ability to take up to 2 years unpaid family leave has meant that the number of women working for them has dramatically increased. So by being much more sensitive to regional differences, they've found that flexibility has really worked for them. Now, every case study you read about flexible working has somewhere in there that we had to get leadership buy-in, and we had to get leaders role modeling, and we had to educate our leaders as to what this meant so they were fully clued up as to the benefits of flexible working. So lots of education, lots of increasing their levels of understanding, lots of celebrating those leaders who actually do it, kind of calling them out and making a big thing of it. And I wanted to highlight 3 very large organizations that have done this very well. So in PwC, and I mentioned them earlier, they've had a real emphasis on flexible working. And they say that, we've got to talk about flexibility until it sticks, and making sure that leaders are talking about it too. And getting to that point has taken them a lot of time, a lot of effort, a little trial and error. But everybody now talks about it, and it's now become much more accepted. It's what they do. So getting your leaders just to use the language of flexible working. In Telstra, they have, similar to Unilever, an approach which is called All Roles Flex. And they said that the CEO played a major part in getting this off the ground, because he talked about the benefits consistently. So making sure that you're feeding through the benefits, the language, the terminology to your most senior leaders and encouraging them to talk about it. The one I like best, though, is PepsiCo. And in their Asia Pacific division, their leader there, their chief exec, had an initiative called Leaders Leaving Loudly. And this is really them role modeling. And what they said was, if you say that we have an approach which is, we embrace flexible working, we value flexible working, but actually all the leaders are still at their desks in, every hour that God sends, that they don't actually adopt those practices, then it's going to be a real issue, because what that culture of presenteeism survives. So what they did in PepsiCo was encourage leaders to take greater levels of flexibility in their working practices, but also to really make a big deal of it. So as they were going out to take their kids, to the dentist, or they were going off to do something outside of work, to go and do homeworking, they were encouraged to announce it, to really shout about it, so that people heard it, they saw it, and that meant it was all right for them. Finally, on the approach to flexible working and the things that really can make a difference, is making sure that you've got the right tools to support this flexibility. Now, I want to just highlight a quick case study of a company called Appen. They're a machine learning company, and they discovered that flexible working can have downsides. They did an internal survey of some of its team. Now, they employ about 350 full-time employees with flexible work options spread out across 7 countries. And they've also got over 1 million global contractors who are 100% remote. And what they found that was while the team liked the flexibility, it could sometimes leave them feeling really isolated. So to combat this, they started investing in different tools that could make it much less isolating and a much more inclusive environment. So video conferencing, instant messaging, document collaboration solutions. But it also built an internal community forum where employees can do everything from troubleshooting common issues to chatting and getting to know one another. All of the things that you get and take for granted when you have an office environment. Today, 80% of the core workforce say that they're satisfied with their jobs, and their attrition rate dropped by 5% in just 1 year. So what are the best tools to support flexible working? Now, I'm not going to list loads of them, but what I've done is to just highlight those that either Forbes or PC magazine say are the best tech to support flexible working. So first up, we've got project management software, and I wanted to call out Basecamp and Teamwork. So both of them offer similar things like activity tracking for projects, task management, to-do lists, the ability to comment, chat, built-in calendars. If you wanted to kind of differentiate them, Basecamp has a simpler, more intuitive interface. Teamwork has more features, so Gantt charts and better reporting features. And probably better for organizations that are larger or scaling up, whereas Basecamp possibly better for smaller organizations. Next up in your kind of toolbox, if you're going to encourage flexible working, is video conferencing, web-based video conferencing. Now, obviously, there are loads of these on the market, but these two get the best reviews. So first up, Zoom on the left-hand side there, high quality HD video, great sound quality, along with a real mixed, diverse selection of subscription packages, and the ability to have large numbers of participants on one video conference. Fuse, equally useful, but perhaps small and medium enterprises as well as large. It caters as well for global, remote or in the field workers, offers local in-country dialing wherever you're based, and it's also free for meetings with fewer than 25 participants. Finally, in your armory of tools for flexible working is group messaging. Now, Slack is the one that everybody talks about and gets the best ratings. And through the Slack interface, you can set up spaces for teams called channels where you can have conversations, discuss projects. So instead of having to fish through your email to a follower thread, it's all visible in one place for everybody. But, if you're just starting out with flexible working and remote-based working, give WhatsApp a go. It amazes me how many companies still don't use WhatsApp groups as a way of people keeping in contact with each other. So if you're thinking about flexible working, perhaps at the early stages, you really do need, a project management tool, a web-based conferencing, and a group messaging just to get you going. Now, I wanted to finish up with just an example of one of our clients. They wanted to include something in their welcome document, their induction booklet, and they wanted to encourage this kind of idea of a positive approach to flexible working from the very outset. And so they talked about their philosophy. So, we don't measure you by how many hours you work or how much you're in the office. We just care about achieving great outcomes. They recognize that flexibility works both ways, making sure that you're working as a team and sharing this between you, the unsociable hours. Keep your own records. It's not going to be all heavily documented. We trust you to manage your own workload. So I really like the way that they've gone about this. Now, they still have a formal flexible working request and the policies available, but what they're doing is setting out their philosophy, their approach, and also they're making this kind of available to you from your first working day. So you might just want to look at your induction leaflets or your welcome handbook and just say, how much are we setting this out at the very start? So hopefully that has provided a useful way of thinking about flexible working, how you get it going in your organization. So thanks very much for listening.